Journal entry, May 5th. I have reached the base of the mountain and I am preparing myself to climb Mount X. It seems that the mountain is actually much larger than I had anticipated, and I am worried if I can even make the climb. The sheer size of the mountain is something that I underestimated, and I'm worried that I won't even be able to keep myself physically or mentally whole as I make this incredible journey. I've heard stories that some have even lost their minds attempting to do this, and hopefully I will not befall the same fate. As I begin my trek up the mountain, I've noticed that it's not a sheer, craggy face of a mountain like I was anticipating. Instead, I find that it's more sloping hills that are going ever upward, much like the mountains of Appalachia. Time has eroded the colors, the rocks in the area through erosion of all the wind and whatnot. And it's more of a pleasant uphill walk. Some of the features I recognized and some I didn't, but it was a very hardy climb, and I am looking to see what I can find next. Journal entry, June 23rd. As I make my way through the mountain, I've noticed that it has become slightly more vertical, and I'm starting to suspect that I may start to need my various mountain equipment. As I have journeyed further into the mountain, I've also noticed that several of my electronic equipment ceases to work. This is very troubling because I may not be able to signal for help or get specific readings on things like the radiation and spectrographic makeup of the area. My instruments have been acting very wildly. It seems that there is a very strong magnetic signal, and I'm worried that my journey may be called into question because I'm not able to get accurate scientific data. As I go even further, it seems that I have almost hit a wall. There is somewhat of a point where I can't find a way to get to the rest of the mountain. I have tried and tried, but it seems that I just am not able to climb or get around. Hopefully I will have better news on the morrow. Journal entry, July 30th. In a stroke of luck, I have managed to find a bridging point, if you will, between this eroded old section of the mountain to the more recent bits, I suppose you would call it. A bridge was found that sort of connects these two periods of the mountain together. What was interesting is that the bridge seemed a lot newer than the other two parts of the mountain. This suggests that someone came back here, whether it be some sort of indigenous people of the area, these mutants, as I believe the other villagers in the area have called them, or perhaps it could be a climber, someone else who has ascended the mountain, has made their way back down. I could find no sign of any sort of ownership through a carving or a plaque, but I slowly made my way across this bridge. The bridge featured features of new and old things. I recognized some of the features, but others seemed distant. Looking ahead to the next period, this next big section of the mountain, I did spot some features, so perhaps they gathered materials from this extremely old, the genesis of the mountain, if you will, at the base, and used it with materials from this next, more large, sturdy, craggly part of the mountain, and was able to fashion some sort of bridge. It is sturdy, though there are certain points where I fear that I would plummet into this massive gorge below me, this very dark, gaping maw of rock and jags. But luckily, I remain unscathed, and I have crossed the bridge. I have now seen it to lead to a mouth of a cave. This cave is very dark. I can't seem to pierce through its blackness with a simple flashlight. I will need time to prepare to journey through this cave and to, in earnest, begin my journey of the next section of the mountain. Until then, dear reader, please keep your thoughts in for me, as I may not be able to get to this next part alive. And there you have it. Thank you for listening to this introduction for Climbing Mount X. This is the first episode, the giant-sized episode, of what is hopefully going to be a very long-running series. Basically, if you can't tell by the format, I will do sort of a journal-style entry as role-playing a climber. I'm climbing this sort of metaphorical mountain of X, as it were, and I'll be doing some role-play, sort of giving a sort of metaphorical interpretation of my journey, and then I'm going to go on, I'm going to review the books, I'm going to talk about the books, sort of what my thoughts are, what's going to be going forward, all that kind of stuff. But before we get on to that, I do want to lay out sort of my roadmap for how the series is going to play out. I will be using this website, I believe it's called Crushing Crisis, and I think Crisis is spelled with a K maybe, but it's a very good website. All you need to do to really find it is just search X-Men reading order, and it should be like one of like the number 1 and number 2 search on Google. And basically, I'm going to be following this list. I'm going to be doing it in publication order. So I'm starting from X-Men issue 1, and I'm going to be going all the way to the present. I'm going to be reading spin-offs. I'm going to be reading the whole shebang, and it's going to be really fun. Now, when I say the whole shebang, I think a lot of people will ask, well, what do you consider an appropriate spin-off or whatever, and what you consider not essential or non-canonical to X-Men, as it were? And that's a good question. Some things I will definitely read. The Dazzler series, for instance, I'm going to read. Not only just because I find it very interesting, because it's sort of the 70s, and Dazzler is a very interesting character, but I think it does set up a lot of things and is very important to X-Men history. Dazzler is a very important figure in X-Men history. Things I may not read, for example, Deadpool. I'm not going to read Deadpool. I may read the first and second Deadpool classic volumes, just because that is more X-Men centric, and it does focus on more that he is a mutant and he's dealing with mutant stuff. But outside of that, I probably won't read a lot of Deadpool, because Deadpool really isn't impacting a lot of stuff in terms of other characters and in terms of what's going on for X-Men. Now, I may read Cable and Deadpool, because that series does involve Cable, who is a mutant, and it probably does impact his story somewhat. I'll have to do more research on that. But, another thing that I will read is the Uncanny Avengers. It basically does go as a continuation of the Rick Remender Uncanny X-Force series, so that will be something I will be reading. There's some other stuff like the Champions and Defenders series, as well as the New Champions series, I guess, as well. I'm going to have to reserve judgment on that. It could be I might read the Champions because it does have Iceman and Angel in it, and I may read the Defenders. I may not, just because that doesn't really have a lot of impact on their characters, I know Beast was involved in, I think it was the early 2000s Secret Avengers book. Maybe I'll read that. I don't know. It depends on how much of an impact it has on their characters and X-Men's story as a whole. But that's basically what I'm going to be doing. If anyone has any recommendations of specifically what I should read and what I shouldn't, definitely tell me in the comments. I am very receptive to recommendations. So just keep that in mind. I know some people may not be like, oh, don't read Wolverine, read Wolverine. That's ultimately up to me, but definitely give me your suggestions. I'm going to read Wolverine, by the way. Don't worry. But, yeah. So, I'm going to be reading pretty much everything of X-Men. This is going to take a lot of time, especially a lot of money. But it's going to be a very interesting journey, just because there is such a rich history with X-Men, starting from when it was created in the 60s, all the way to the present. They've been through so much, and all the crazy stuff that has happened throughout the different eras of X-Men. It's been so fascinating trying to keep up with, and I want to read it all as one big swooping story, because I have read it in bits and pieces. I've read like Peter David's X Factor, but then I would bounce to a current X-Men series, and then I would jump back to something in the 80s, or then I would quit reading X-Men for a while because I'd get behind on the trades, and then I'd jump on the latest X-Men series. So I've been reading them kind of out of order. I've been jumping around a lot. So to read it in just one big, huge story, basically, would be a very enjoyable experience, and I could really appreciate that history. But enough of that. Let's get on to the review. So in today's episode, I'm going to be reviewing the full original X-Men, X-Men number 1 through X-Men 66, as well as X-Men The Hidden Years Volume 1 and 2. Now, I'm deciding to bundle these two together because it's essentially the same story, as well as there's not a lot that happens in these stories as a whole. There are big points. For example, Jean Grey getting telepathy from Professor Xavier, or Iceman getting stronger with his powers, or the Angel losing his father, and a bunch of other stuff. So there's not a lot that happens throughout. There are big points, excuse me, but I'm going to try and touch on those, as well as just talk about how I feel about the books in general. So starting off, X-Men, it was a really interesting first issue. Their costumes do sort of reflect a school uniform touch. I actually really liked the first series as a whole. They did a really good job of introducing these characters. They had some really cool villains. They didn't have a really expansive rogues gallery compared to like today, where they have just like a millions, billions, bad guys. And at the beginning, it was like, we got Magneto, we have the Blob, Eunice the Untouchable, Juggernaut. That's basically it. They do fight some really hokey villains, but I'll get to that in a little bit. But they had a really good way of introducing everything. They showed off, these guys' powers. Cyclops is sort of this stern, tall guy. He's not really one who plays around. He's the Boy Scout, sort of. Hank McCoy, aka the Beast, he is a really like a bruiser guy. Like, he is super built, he's built for punching, but he's also super smart, and it's a really interesting dichotomy of, well, he has brains and brawn. And then you have Angel Warrington the Third. He can fly. Now, that sounds really dumb at first, and if I was just describing, he just has wings, and you're like, that gets him in the X-Men, but as time goes on, you see that he's actually a very important member of the team and how he operates. And then you have Bobby Drake, Iceman. He's the youngest, and you can kind of tell by his sort of immature personality. He is the one that's usually starting a lot of little fights that break out between the X-Men. He's sort of a hothead, ironically, since his power is ice, which I think is actually a really great touch, when you think about it. But, Iceman is very young, and he's very juvenile. He's really trying to learn how to be an X-Men and be a part of a team, and I think that over the course of the series, you could really see that. And then you have Jean Grey, who is the girl. That's kind of how she is. It sucks. Reading these older issues, that kind of sucks, but that's just how it was back then, unfortunately. But Jean Grey is the girl, and her power is telekinesis. And I don't, you'll notice that I didn't mention also her being a telepath. That comes later, and it's sort of interesting. But this is the core X-Men, and it's really interesting because as sort of the book develops, you really see this sort of great mix of superhero action and sort of teen soap opera. Scott and Warren are these romantic rivals that are really trying to notice Jean, and Jean really likes Scott, but she doesn't know how to tell him. And Beast is just lamenting that he just looks weird, and he wants to just be normal. And Iceman is sort of the young gun of the team, and he wants to get respect. He's young, but no one respects him. And he has a hot temper, and through it all, Professor Xavier, this wheelchair-bound man who has a great mind and is a telepath, is trying to bring these mutants together to bring the human and the mutant world together in peace. And what's interesting is this theme isn't really touched on at first. At first, it's just these are a bunch of kid superheroes that are fighting other evil superheroes of a sort of similar power origin. But eventually, it does come to as the X-Men are sort of meeting more and more hostility between humans and mutants, and humans are not liking, what they see about mutants. You really do get this theme, and I think that the book, even though it is old and the dialogue is outdated, you do really say that they're really working toward these themes and they're really working on building them up, and they're not just putting them down one after the other. It feels really rich to just see Cyclops just develop as a character. Everyone kind of bashes Cyclops, and then they go, "Oh, Cyclops is he's just this bland leader guy." But after reading this, I can totally identify with Cyclops. He is someone who has a lot thrusted on his shoulders. He's the leader. He has a devastating power that he cannot control, and he is in love with this girl that he just doesn't know how to tell her that, and he doesn't know if she loves him back. And there's this really great scene in one issue, I can't remember the number, but he's just so frustrated. He goes off on his own while everyone else is playing in the snow, and he just blah, he loses it, and he shoots this huge optic blast at this mountain, and it almost causes a rock slide, and I think it almost kills him. And that's the kind of thing that you're seeing. He has to bottle himself up and keep himself in check because he's afraid of his own powers. And that's not the case with a lot of the other X-Men. Iceman loves his powers. Iceman goes out of his way to use his powers and to be a jokester with them. Jean is able to pass easily, and she finds her powers very useful. Beast and Angel are interesting cases because they have to sort of disguise themselves. But Warren absolutely loves his wings. He loves to fly. He there are even several points throughout the comic where he laments whenever he can't fly, or when he has to put his wings on these special binders. He absolutely adores his powers. Beast is an interesting case because he is mixed about them. He likes to sort of bound and fly, but at the same time he doesn't like how he looks. He wants to look normal. And so it's very interesting to see that Scott is the one that really struggles with sort of liking his powers. And throughout the series, you do get a lot of really great points. You're introduced to the Juggernaut. You're introduced to a lot of other cool characters. My only gripe about this whole original run is that it's very kooky. There are parts that are just incredibly corny. Like, there's one issue where they fight a guy named the Locust, and he's basically just dressed as a giant grasshopper, and he can just control insects because he has these little dealy bopper antennas on his head, on his helmet, and it's just really just goofy. And there are other characters, like Eunice is kind of a dorky character, and he just they kind of just face dumb characters sometimes, and they go through some really wacky stories. Like Merlin is a villain in a story arc for a couple of issues, and that's weird. They go to the Savage Land. Savage Land is cool, but they go to it a lot, which I think I understand why no one likes the Savage Land, just because you go to the Savage Land and then you have to run to Kazar, and then you have to do what you have to do, and that's the whole thing, and then you have to go home, and that's really annoying. So yeah, but I do think that as the X-Men was sort of running closer and closer to this end cycle for them, the book was struggling. They were trying to figure out new ways to get the book going, and they brought on some really, really cool artists and really cool writers to try and pump things up with excitement. They had the Sentinel arc, which was really great. I believe Neil Adams did the artwork for that, and the artwork for the issues that were introducing Havoc and Polaris and doing the whole Sentinel thing, it was great. It was some really pulpy, really great art, and I really loved looking at the panels and going through the panels of sort of the last few issues of X-Men, the last 10-ish issues or so, because the art was really great. Now, what's interesting is that the final arc really did feel like just the big goodbye for X-Men. This alien race called the Xenox was coming in. They were fixing to invade, and Professor gathers his X-Men, the original 5 plus the newbies of Havoc and Polaris, they came together and they're like, okay, there's this alien invasion coming in, you got to stop them. And they all come together and they all use their gifts to the fullest potential, and they save the human race. And it ends on this really happy note of Professor Xavier is lying in bed, everyone is gathered around him, everyone's smiling, and it's like the end. It's like, okay, they did it. But yeah, it was very interesting, but I really enjoyed it. My favorite bits were probably some of the issues with Magneto, because those were really fun. A couple of the Juggernaut issues, any of the big issues, really, those were great. My biggest nitpicks were, there were some continuity issues. I know that one time when the Juggernaut came, they explained his origin one way, and then I believe the second time the Juggernaut made an appearance and they had to fight him, they changed his origin. And it was actually kind of funny because that's like a staple thing of the X-Men. Like, oh, they retconned it. But yeah, it was a really enjoyable thing. I really enjoyed it. I recommend it if you're an X-Men fan and you really just want to get in touch with the history and sort of how it all started. Read the first 66 issues, because I really enjoyed them. Now, this next piece that I did read was X-Men The Hidden Years. Now, this was written by John Byrne, a famous Marvel artist and writer. Now, he, sort of the idea behind this story is he wanted to fill in the gaps between when the X-Men originally finished, which was issue 66. Now, the X-Men did keep going, but they were just reprinting issues. They were reprinting stories and just changing covers. So there was really no point in reading 66 or 67 through 93, I think. That's just sort of a black hole. You can't, it's a pitch black cave. You can't get through it. But the Hidden Years, what it was designed to do was bridge this gap between issue 66 and issue 94, I think, or Giant Size X-Men number 1. I can't remember which comes first, but it's a bridging of the gap between those two eras. And it was really interesting. I did like that it sort of extended the narratives. It did give a bit more character development. Iceman is still this sort of hothead. He's trying to fight over Polaris because they were kind of a thing, but they kind of weren't. And Havoc and her are basically an item forever. And Havoc's, he does like that, so they're always kind of squabbling. Another interesting point is that the team is really starting to splinter off and drift apart. Warren is having family issues because, his uncle actually killed his father over some weird business that he had tricked his father into. And, his uncle killed his father, and then he was marrying his mother. And then it turns out that he killed his mom because he wanted to get all the inheritance and stuff. That's super fucked up. So there's stuff going on with Angel. Beast is really worried that he's going to lose control of himself because he has all this strength, and there was this really great part, I can't remember the issue. For next time, we'll make a better job of making notes. This is sort of free form. I'm actually in a hotel room, so I don't have access to a lot of stuff. I'm just recording this on my iPad because I really wanted to get this out now that I've finished The Hidden Years and I'm moving on to the next step. But, there's this really great issue in The Hidden Years. It's in volume 2. But Beast is having to be hunted by Kraven, the hunter, and eventually they actually do square off, and Beast is just pissed. He's sick of being hunted. His friend, Kraven's putting his friends in danger. Beast is having none of it, and Beast just starts going after him. He's straight up ready to kill him. And I think that's a point when he realizes I could really be a danger if I'm not in check. And the team is also sort of drifting apart. Havoc and Polaris are moving away from the team because they never really felt like part of the team. And this is how I felt as well. They were never really included in a lot of adventures, and they were never really included just in stories, period. They were kind of there, but they were never in sort of the big adventure aspect of we're coming with you. They're off to the side doing their own thing or whatever. And, so they're drifting apart that way. Also, Professor X has used a lot of subterfuge with the team throughout the X-Men history so far. He has lied. He's faked his death. He had lied about dying. He had tricked the team a couple times, and Iceman is very wary about it. He actually quits the team for a little bit. The other team members, Jean, Scott, and Henry, they're very worried about it as well. And I think that the book never gets to it, but they were sort of leading at this point of maybe they should really rethink their relationship with Professor X. And that's really interesting that they're sort of setting up stuff, and it's sort of leading to that point. It does also hint to some stuff that's in the future. It hints at the Phoenix. It introduces Storm. There's a really cool story arc where Cyclops, Jean, and Hank are in Africa, and they run into Storm, and they go on an adventure with her, and that's super cool. That was actually a really fun story. And yeah, that's kind of it. It's just sort of a bridging a gap. It provides some extra stories to kind of set up for what's happening or what's going to happen later. It only has 22 issues, and it kind of just ends. There's not really a finalizing, okay, now we go into the Chris Claremont stuff. It just kind of ends, and that's a real shame. I did read that he had a lot of plans for the Hidden Years that he was going to work in, and he was going to do that for like 100 issues or so. He was going to do so much with that book. Like, I think he had plans to start introducing Rogue and Mystique. I think he had plans to introduce, I think, maybe the other second generation X-Men in terms of like Wolverine and Colossus and Nightcrawler, I think. So he definitely was working towards something, but the book got canceled, unfortunately. But it's a really fun book if you want something that can sort of further give you characterization on these young X-Men in the early years of the X-Men, and if you want some more fun stories with some really cool art. The art's really great. Definitely pick it up. Overall, I've been enjoying my climb so far. It hasn't gotten too hectic yet because there hasn't been a lot of spin-offs. There hasn't been a lot of going back and forth between books or anything to really get sort of the full picture of a story arc. But so far, I'm really enjoying it. I'm really looking forward to the Chris Claremont era, which is what I'm going to be reading next. I ordered the first volume of that era of the omnibus, the Chris Claremont. I think it's just called Uncanny X-Men Omnibus, but I ordered the first volume. I believe there's 3. I'm going to try and cut up the Chris Claremont stuff more, just so I can get more videos out, as well as talk more about X-Men, as well as, this is a big section of history. So I'm going to try to cut up that more. I'm going to try to also keep everyone updated on what I'm going to be reading next following this list, so you can read along with me. Actually, if you want, that would be great. Talk a bit in the comments about X-Men and what I think so far. But yeah, that's it. Tune in next time. I'm going to be tackling the first bit of the Chris Claremont era, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you climbing with me soon.